I'm going to go ahead and get started. If we haven't met, my name's Lori Dunagan. I'm one of the coaches with the productivity coaching program. Normally, Brittany is with you for the workshop, but I don't know if you guys saw the email or not. Brittany has decided to pursue real estate full time, and so she has stepped away from the being a coach with the program. And so, with that, we have made some changes. And so instead of this being a weekly workshop, we are now going to turn it into a contracts and conversations workshop. And so with all of the changes that are going on in the industry, we figured some extra emphasis on not just on contracts and how to fill out the contracts, but what type of conversations we need to be having around them and what we need to be telling our buyers or our sellers or our clients. So we're going to be focusing on that at least for the next few weeks, and then we'll see what makes sense to to do in this slot. But definitely we have a bunch of changes with our contracts. Did you guys see that the additional contracts were released in draft form last week?
Yes.
Have you had a chance to look at any of those yet?
I missed that Thursday contracts class at my market center. They were going to go over them. Our broker was coming in, but they did do a recording I'm going to watch later.
Very good. CAR is doing some workshops. I think they've got 3 of them scheduled this week, but if you miss them or can't attend them, they also have, they had at least one of them that was recorded. And so that is something good to go look at and watch as well. All right, so I'm going to go over 2 things today, and then we can talk about anything that you guys potentially want to talk about as far as, contracts go. But I want to go over the seller in possession form, and that is when a seller closes escrow but still needs to remain in the house for a number of days. And so we're going to talk about that form and the pros and cons of that. And then we're not going to talk about the new listing agreement, but there's one portion of the new listing agreement that I do want to pull up and share with you guys, because the way that we do compensation on the listing agreement has changed drastically just in the draft forms that were released last week. And so I want to make sure that you guys are aware of that change. I don't know if the draft forms are essentially final because they're going to be releasing the final forms in a couple of weeks. So there may or may not be any changes from this. I don't know, but I want to just kind of share what that is. So any questions about those things before I get started?
Lori, as you're going through this, is there anything in black and white that we can kind of follow through with this, like hard copies we can print out quick?
So if you went, I'm going to, let me see. I think I can put the link in the chat to both forms. I am going to share my screen though.
Okay.
So if I share my screen, do you still want the hard copies or?
They'll be fine.
Okay.
The screen will be fine.
Okay, so let me do that really quick. So this is the purchase agreement, and I'm not going to go over the purchase agreement today, but I want to show you. So this is the first page of it. So see down at the bottom, it's page 1 of 17. This is the second page of it. And down here on section 3M, we're talking about possession. So by default, when a escrow closes, that is the moment upon recording that possession changes from seller to buyer. So we want to make sure when we're representing a seller that they understand that they actually have to be completely moved out of the house and ready to hand it to the buyer before it closes escrow. Now, that can cause a little bit of an issue for some sellers because they won't get the funds from the sale until after it closes. And depending on where they're moving, they may need those funds to make that move. Like I had a client that had loaded everything up into a U-Haul and they were driving to Pennsylvania. Well, they really needed those funds. And So it's important that we're having those conversations. Also, let's say that we're doing a concurrent close. So let's say your seller is selling their home and at the same time they're purchasing another home, and both of those homes are closing at the same time, right? They're closing concurrently. Well, that's great, except the seller needs to be out of their existing home when escrow closes, but they can't get into their new home until escrow closes. So what are their options? Load everything up into a U-Haul truck and sit on the side of the road waiting for one to close for the other one to, to also close so they can move in. Like, you can see where that would not be an ideal situation for a seller, right? And it would be more convenient if they could close on their existing home and then have a few days to get moved into their new home. And so those are the scenarios where a seller in possession or an SIP come into play. So if we look at M1, like I said, it defaults to upon notice of recording. M2, seller occupied or vacant unit. So our close of, okay, so we're selecting which one. So are we saying that get it at the close of escrow date, or do they get possession a few days later? So we've got two options, M2. It's 29 days or fewer, and that's when we would use the seller in possession form. Or if it's over 30 days, then we would use a residential lease agreement. Don't know what that stands for. RLAS. I don't remember exactly what that stands for. If at all possible, I suggest avoiding the over 30-day scenario because the paperwork on that becomes a lot more involved. The SIP form is, I think, 2 pages and a lot easier to use. So the time to negotiate if the seller needs to stay in possession is when we are going under contract. Because if we accept an offer as a seller and then we want to say, oh, but wait, we want to stay a few more days, we've lost our position of power, right? And so if you know your seller is going to need to stay in possession, the best thing to do is to put that in the agent notes on the MLS. That way, any agent that shows the house can tell their clients, hey, the seller is going to want to stay for a certain number of days. And when we are talking to the other agents and they're submitting an offer, we want to reiterate the sellers want to stay, submit an SIP form with your offer. That way, it would potentially prevent us from needing to do a counteroffer. But if we get an offer and the SIP form's not attached, then we want to do a counter offer to the buyer so that we get the SIP into that first initial agreement. Because like I said, once we go under escrow, seller loses their power. Okay, so that's what I want to go over. So when we select this box and we put in, okay, so in this scenario, the seller is going to stay for 5 days. This should automatically attach the SIP form, but if it doesn't, we want to make sure that we attach it ourselves. So I'm going to go over to the SIP form right now, but do we have any questions on this? Okay. So then this is the seller license to remain in possession addendum, intended for possession of 29 days or less. Now, they are not using the term rental agreement, lease. They're using license to remain in possession. What they're trying to do with this form is avoid creating a tenant-landlord relationship. But it says here that, right here, it says, note, local rent control or other laws regarding tenant rights may impact buyers and sellers' rights and obligations. And so it's a good idea to recommend that our clients speak to somebody that's familiar with tenant rules. And as much as the language in this form is trying to prevent creating a tenant-landlord agreement or relationship, it doesn't mean that that's not being created. So just be aware of that. Now, what are some of the risks to a buyer to let a seller remain in possession?
Them not leaving.
Them not leaving. That's a big one, right? What's another risk?
They can damage the property accidentally.
Yes. Yes. So when we have a buyer and they're submitting an offer on a house where the seller's wanting to stay in possession, we want to make sure that we let them know that those risks exist, right? There's the risk that seller doesn't move out. There's the risk that seller damages the house before they move out, right? I'm sure there's other risks in there as well. There are, and we'll talk about those in a minute. But what's the risk if the buyer does not allow the seller to stay? Any guesses?
There's no sale?
Yeah, they risk the seller not accepting their offer. So anytime we do a real estate transaction, there's always risk. There's risk to the buyer, there's risk to the seller. Those risks vary depending on what the scenario is. And so, we want to mitigate the risk for our clients. And in this scenario, they got to decide which risk is better. The risk of getting to buy the house or the risk of, them potentially not moving out. Now, here's what I like to say. When we go in the house, we pretty much see, I know when a seller puts their home on the market, they're going to usually spruce it up, make it look, maybe a little bit nicer than it looks on a day-to-day basis, but we kind of get a general idea of how well the seller takes care of the house or doesn't take care of the house. So, we don't want to assume things, but my assumption would be that if a seller has lived here for 15 years, they've taken care of it. If we let them stay 3 extra days, they're probably still going to take care of it, right? Seller is deciding to sell their house because they have other plans, they're moving, they got somewhere to go. So there's probably not a high probability that they're going to stay, but it's still a risk, right? Okay. So let's look at this. So this is an addendum to the purchase agreement or a counteroffer. So again, if we get an offer and it doesn't have this form, but we need it there, then we'll do a counteroffer and we'll make it an addendum to that on the property between buyer and seller. And at this point, we would know both parties' names, right? So we'd have those there. The addendum is intended to grant seller, again, a license to remain in possession and use the property. Says regardless of the length of the time of possession, buyer is advised to consult with a qualified local landlord attorney to discuss whether the possession could be interpreted as creating a landlord-tenant relationship between buyer and seller. So we want to make sure we point that out to them just so they know that risk, right? And then it says close of escrow shall be day 0 for the purposes of counting days for the term of this license to remain in possession. So what that means is if we close escrow today and they're allowed to stay for 5 days, so today is Monday's day 0, and then we go Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. So they would be able to be there until Saturday. So it's important that we all know what days we're counting. Now that's the same thing with a purchase agreement as well. The day that the offer is accepted counts as day 0, and then, our days count from there. Not everybody realizes that. Okay, so on number 1, what's the term? Seller is granted a license to remain in possession of the property for X number of calendar days after close of escrow or to a specific date. So maybe they need it because they know that, they're moving or their job's ending on whatever date, so they just need it to a specific date. But just know that when we're putting in an offer, if we're doing a 30-day escrow, they need it 3 days later. Put in 3 calendar days, not the date 3 days later, because escrow might close late, and then that's going to affect the time that they have. It does say calendar days, so that includes weekends and holidays. So if it counts where they end up moving out on Christmas Day, they're moving out on Christmas Day. So that's another thing to kind of keep an eye on, potentially is what days we're looking at here. They have until 6 p.m. Do you think it's good that they have until 6 p.m. to vacate on that day, or would you suggest something different?
No, I will suggest by noon.
By noon, okay?
Yeah.
Any other suggestions?
But doesn't this just act as a hard line so that everybody's on the same page, knowing when they're gonna be out of there?
Yes.
Okay.
My suggestion here is to put midnight.
Oh,
Now, why would I choose midnight?
Give them a full day.
We're giving them a full day. I'm going to choose midnight because let's say we do noon or we do 6 p.m. and it's taking the seller longer than they anticipated. I don't want the buyer to be there or be blowing up my phone. Hey, it's 2 o'clock. They're not there. They're not out. They're supposed to be out at noon. You know, I'm calling the cops, whatever. Like it could turn ugly, right? Because emotions run high in real estate transactions. But if I say midnight, the buyer's probably not there at midnight 30 seeing if they're out, right? They're going to get up in the morning, they're going to assume they're out, they're going to go, and that gives the seller a couple more hours, not legally, not contractually, but in theory it gives them a couple more hours where the buyer might not be upset about it, right? So I like midnight there. Says seller has no right to remain in possession beyond this term and may be responsible for court awarded damages if seller does remain. And so what that means is that if we have to go to an eviction process, which then takes time, they might be responsible. Okay, so consideration. If we're going to let them stay in our house for a certain number of days after we purchase it, are they paying for any of that? Are we letting them stay for free? Are we charging them? If so, what are we charging them? I've seen a lot of times where they are allowed to stay for free, and that's great for a seller. But a buyer, once they purchase the house, now they're responsible for that mortgage payment, right? And so if you let them stay for 2 weeks, well, that's 2 weeks of mortgage payment that falls onto the buyer that they're not getting reimbursed for. The other thing to kind of keep in mind here is that depending how long the seller has owned the house, they might have a mortgage that's $1,000 and the new buyer's mortgage is $3,000, right? And so when we look at, well, I'll pay half a month's mortgage, buyer and seller aren't necessarily talking about the same number there. So that's just a little side note. So we can say that seller agrees to pay buyer. Okay, again, a non-refundable license fee. So we're not saying rent and we're not saying, lease. A license fee for the term specified above of so much per day or a flat amount. So we don't have to charge them, but if we do charge them, what are we going to charge them? And then we have the option of those funds. So seller shall deposit such funds with escrow holder prior to close of escrow, or they could be withdrawn from seller's proceeds. At close of escrow, all consideration will be released to buyer or held in escrow. Which do you think is a better option?
held in escrow.
What was that?
Held in escrow.
Okay. That's what I would have thought at first. But if you think about this, so the buyer's buying the house, so now buyer owns house because we closed escrow, right? And seller's staying for, let's say, 5 days. Does it hurt to give the buyer that money up front? Like it doesn't, right? Because it's the buyer's money. The seller's staying for 5 days. It's the buyer's money. So it doesn't hurt. So I would go ahead and let it default to what it is and let the money be released to the buyer at the close of escrow. If seller vacates the property, let me ask you, I know you guys can see it here, but let's say seller is going to pay $1,000 and they're going to stay there for 5 days, but they only stay for 3 days. Do they get some of that $1,000 back?
They should.
Everything's negotiable. And so it could be set up however we want it to be set up. And if they were going to get some of that money back, then I would say in that scenario, I would leave the funds with escrow. But the default language says that if seller vacates the property prior to the end of the term, no portion of the consideration will be returned unless seller otherwise agrees in writing. So, so by default, whatever dollar amount is identified is the dollar amount that the buyer gets, regardless of whether the seller moves out sooner or not. Then there's an option for late charges. This, in my opinion, doesn't really apply because if the funds are going to be paid through escrow, we're not taking like a weekly payment from them or a monthly payment from them. It's less than 30 days, like it's a one-time thing, then there's really not going to be a late fee. And so there's really nothing to, I wouldn't worry about filling this part out. If you want to put a number in there, you can. Okay, so what is the seller's obligation for condition of the property? So keep this in mind. Seller has lived in this house for 15 years. It's their house, right? They're very familiar with it. It's been their house for 15 years. They've raised their kids there, all the things, right? Now, all of a sudden we close escrow, but seller's going to stay there for, 2 more weeks. It's still going to feel like the seller's house to the seller, right? Like, it's not like something's going to switch and automatically they feel like, oh, this isn't my house anymore. Like, they still live there. So as far as maintenance goes, unless this is rewritten somewhere else, seller's going to maintain the property, including the pool, the spa, the yard work, all of that, in the same condition, right? Now, what about insurance? Seller is no longer the homeowner, right? So will the insurance company allow them to maintain homeowners insurance? No. The buyer hasn't moved in yet, but he is the homeowner, right? So he needs to have homeowners insurance. So now, if let's say something happens where seller would normally just file a homeowner's claim, well, now they can't do it in that time period because they're no longer the owner of the home, right? So what happens if in this period, seller staying for 10 days, escrow has closed, we're on day 3, and the air conditioner breaks? Who's responsible for that?
The buyer.
Technically, yeah, the buyer, because the buyer is the homeowner now, right? Now, it does say that seller has to make reasonable efforts to maintain the property, but if something like that happens, or let's say there's a fire, right? Like, where does the responsibility of that fall?
Right.
So it can get messy. And there's not like specific answers to these things. It could be like case by case and what were the facts around it. But these are just things to like be aware of when we're doing a seller in possession. It's not just, okay, seller's going to stay here for, 10 more days. Like, there's other things to consider here. Now, if something happens, like the air conditioning goes out, how do you think the buyer is going to feel? Because buyer hasn't even moved in yet. Yes, they own the house, but they've not even moved in yet, right? They're not going to feel like that's on them. So just things to keep in mind.
With the insurance, I'm sorry, with the insurance cover, if that happens, even though buyer.
So as long as buyer should at that point have homeowners insurance. They should have homeowners insurance effective the day that it closes escrow. If they're getting a mortgage, that will be a requirement. If it's a cash sale, that's not a requirement. And so, but then we're still looking at what does the insurance company cover or not cover. Hopefully they got a home warranty and hopefully the home warranty will cover that, but home warranty doesn't cover everything. Even if it's a covered item, home warranty still doesn't cover everything. So it's just now this gray area where it's going to involve, different parties. Hopefully everybody's reasonable. Hopefully it's not a big dollar amount, but just be aware that these things can happen.
Thank you.
Okay, so delivery of possession. Seller shall deliver the property in the condition and on the terms provided in the agreement. Delivery of possession fee. So this fee is saying that seller agrees to deposit with escrow holder a specific amount, and at close of escrow, this fee will be released to the buyer or held in escrow. So what this is kind of like a security deposit. This incentivizes the seller to return the property in the condition that it should be returned in, right? So I would definitely recommend charging a delivery and possession fee, because again, the seller will get it back. They just don't get it when escrow closes. And this is one where we have the option. So this fee can be released to the buyer or it can be held in escrow. And so in this scenario, I want it held in escrow because the money isn't going to belong to the buyer. It's going to belong to the seller when they get their money back because it's just a deposit. And so I don't want the buyer to all of a sudden be like, oh, wait, I just bought a new sofa. Now I don't have that money anymore, you know, something to that effect. So I would definitely mark this box.
Okay.
Any questions on any of that so far? Okay. So then utilities, this just states that seller agrees to pay for all utilities and any related utility services. So again, they've been living there for 15 years. They're just, instead of having utilities turned off today, they're going to have it turned off when they move out. Entry, this specifies that the seller has to make the property available for the buyer to enter, to make any necessary agreed on repairs, or to show the home to prospective tenants or contractors or whatever. Buyer does have to provide the seller with 24-hour notice. But hopefully a buyer wouldn't need to be in the house in that time frame and they could just wait till seller moves out. Keys, this specifies, does the new buyer get a copy of the keys when we close escrow, or do they get a copy of the keys 10 days later when seller moves out? No subletting the home. This talks about insurance, and you know what's possibly covered or not covered. And then if there's any other terms or conditions or supplements. Okay, so that's, I mean, pretty simple. 2 pages. I mean, it's basically 1 page, but it's 2 pages. If you do the over 30 days and you do the RLAS, I don't know how many pages it is offhand, but it's something like, I don't know, 5 or 7 or 10 pages. It's a lot more involved than this, because then it goes to being an actual lease.
I'm sorry.
Yes.
I have a question. Let's see, we give it to the buyer, the seller will stay 5 days, and we give the money to the buyer for those 5 days.
Mhm.
But then, and of course, we have a deposit with escrow, right? So
Mhm.
the buyer don't leave the property after 5 days and decide to stay 3 more days. Can we get the money from the escrow to pay for those 3 days?
So what would happen is, in this scenario, escrow would essentially be done unless there was a what do you call it? Delivery of possession fee. So when escrow closes, so let's say seller is staying for a certain number of days and they're going to pay $1,000 to stay for those days, right? So when escrow closes, ideally we would just let that $1,000 go to the buyer at that point, right? So in that scenario, there's no money left in escrow, right? Because all the money's been dispersed. And now seller doesn't move out. Well, now we got an issue. And so that's where, as agents, we can step in. And even this, so once we close escrow, like, we're technically done as agents, right? And so now it becomes an issue between buyer and seller, and they need to be negotiating that themselves. But ideally, what we'd want to do is, okay, if you need 3 more days, we'll let you stay for 3 more days, and it's going to cost you this amount of money, and you need to pay that like right now, and then we'll let you stay. But if we don't come to agreement on that, like, it can get ugly. That's when then we have to start involving, you know, lawyers or eviction services or whatnot. And so that goes to the risk. Now, let me see here. Delivery of possession fee. It says that this fee will be released to the buyer within 5 days after delivery a possession to buyer, buyer shall return the fee to seller if delivered to buyer in the condition specified and on the date specified. So if you have a delivery and possession fee and they then come back and say, you know what, we're not out, we're going to be here 3 more days. This says that they then forfeit that fee because they're not delivering it on the date specified. So that would be another reason to have a delivery of possession fee. But hopefully all parties are, you know, are playing friendly. And this is where we can set up expectations too. So if we're working with the buyer, we're giving them a seller in possession for 10 days, we might just have that conversation. So they're absolutely supposed to move out in 10 days. I've seen it before where they need an extra day or two. They're not contractually obligated or, you know, allowed to have those extra 2 days. But if they end up asking for it, like, don't be surprised. And so you can kind of just plant that seed that something like that might happen. Because a lot of times it just goes to expectations. People are a lot more willing to accept something like that if they're like, oh, well, yeah, my agent did mention that this could happen, even if it's not supposed to.
Okay.
So there's like 1,000 places in these contracts where we want to be setting expectations with our clients.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Anything else on the seller in possession? I'm going to show you, let me see. Okay, so I want to show you, so I'm going to add a form by hitting this all forms button, and I want to show you the RLAS. Residential lease after sale, that's what I was looking for. Okay. I'm not going to go over this, but I'm just going to show you this part really quick. So this is for 30 days or more. This is page 1 of 8. So our 2-page document now becomes an 8-page document. Now we're using terms like rent because this is actually a lease. We're talking about security deposit. We're talking about late charges. We're talking about parking and storage. We're talking about, you know, smoking in the house. We're talking about, you know, how many keys and where are the keys and mailbox keys. And we're talking about, you know, all these extra things that we don't talk about in that little 1-page document. So that's why I recommend, if you can avoid the going over 29 days, to definitely do that. Okay, so let me show you the other form, and then we might be done a little bit early today. So this is the residential listing agreement. This is the one that was just released last week. It is in draft form, and you can see everything in red is what they've changed. So if you notice, they haven't changed too much about it, just like pretty much the whole form, right? Okay, so one of the things that I really like about this this new agreement is that they've made it more in line with the purchase agreement, in that everything's in these boxes, right? So it makes it a lot easier to, especially for our clients, to understand these forms when everything is like right up front. And so it's got additional details. So this is like, you know, section 2A right here, 2A1. But if I want additional details on what this is talking about, I can go to 4G, paragraph 4G, which is down here, and it'll give me more information, more detailed information. But what I wanted to talk about right here is compensation. Now, this is something that, you know, we've been talking about a lot over the last few months. This is something that we're still figuring out. This is supposed to go into effect, what is it, August 17th or 27th? I think 17th. Okay. But depending on your MLS, it could go into effect sooner than that, right? And like I said, these forms are going to be released in official format in just a couple weeks. So I got to be careful with my language here. So, you know, commission has always been negotiable. It will continue to be negotiable. And there's no like standard or set prices. But let's just say, as an example, if I was doing a listing agreement right now, I might say, okay, Mr. Seller, the commission amount that I'm charging you is 6%. And out of that 6%, we're going to offer 3% to the buyer's broker, right? And, we would negotiate that and they would come to agreement or not. Okay. So here's what's changed about this. And this is a new change just as of last week, because the forms that had been released prior to last week aren't doing what this one does. We are now negotiating 100% for our commission as the sellers, and we are not negotiating for the buyer broker commission at all. So there is nowhere on this form to put how much is going to go to a buyer's broker. So when we look at C1, compensation to seller's broker, only the seller side of a transaction. So this, in that same scenario, I would put 3% of the listing price, and if any, I could put a flat dollar amount. So if I was going to charge them, let's say I do 3% plus my transaction fee of, $500, whatever my transaction fee is, I would put that there. Or I could charge them a flat amount, so I don't even have to do a percentage. I could do a flat amount. Or there's an attached compensation schedule. Now, I have not looked at this attached compensation schedule, so I can't speak to that today because I don't know what it says yet. But this is just what you as the seller or seller's broker is earning, right? Side note, if we do charge, and if any, so let's say I'm going to charge a $500 transaction fee, I can only charge what that actual cost is. I cannot make any profit on that. And if I charge that to one seller, I have to charge it to every single seller that I do business with, or else I could get in trouble for discrimination. So just know that. There's another box for additional compensation to seller's broker if the buyer is unrepresented. And so this does not mean that we would be representing an unrepresented seller or buyer. It means that there might be additional work for us representing the seller if the buyer comes and doesn't have any representation, because they're not going to have access to forms. They're not going to know, I'm speaking in generalities here. They might know, but generally speaking, they're not going to know some of the things that an agent representing them would know. So that's going to put additional work on us. And so if a seller takes an offer from an unrepresented buyer, we might charge them an extra percentage or an extra flat fee for that. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, if we do this, let's say we're getting an extra 1% because the buyer is unrepresented, we have to be very careful, and there's a form to give to the buyer that explains this, but we have to be very careful not to do anything that gives the impression that we are actually representing the buyer, because we're not. We're getting paid by our seller to represent, or not to represent, but to do a transaction with an unrepresented buyer. We are in no way representing that buyer that doesn't want to be represented. Okay, so that was the big change. That was, the big change to me on this form. So I wanted to make sure that I went over that with you guys. Any questions on that?
Yeah, when they said is additional compensation if buyer is unrepresented, that is like kind of a dual agency?
No, because we are not representing them. So we got to be very clear here. This is a buyer who does not have an agent, and even though we're going to be dealing with them instead of their agent, we are not representing them. And so we have to be very clear that we're not doing things for them that an agent would typically do for them. Because sometimes, even if our intention is not to represent them, through our actions, we can create a relationship where we're representing them. And so we have to be very careful on that. And that's going to be like, you're going to have to get guidance from your broker. And that's one of those things where we're just going to have to kind of see what that ends up looking like. Because we're not used to doing that, you know. I mean, I'm not saying that nobody's done a transaction like that in the past, because there have been those types of transactions, but they're very uncommon right now. And I think that they're going to get a lot more common now. Now, if we were actually representing them, then that would be dual agency. And so this is where, so there is no so when these changes first came about, the seller was still able to offer compensation on the listing agreement. It just couldn't go into the MLS, right? Which that didn't really make sense to me. Now they've got it more in alignment, or at least the way my brain works. They're not only are we not putting it in the MLS, they're not offering it. Now, does that mean that we don't have a conversation with our seller about this? No, we definitely want to have conversations with our sellers about this, because just because it's not on the contract between seller and their agent doesn't mean that buyer's not going to want them to pay it. So we still need to set that expectation that when we start receiving offers, they're probably going to ask you to pay for their agent, right? And so the seller's not surprised or shocked about it. And so if I was doing a seller net sheet for a seller where I say, okay, if we list it at this and you pay me this commission, and then I always put, like, let's say estimated repairs might be 3,000. They might ask for a home warranty. That'll be like 500. So I'm putting those things in my seller net sheet just to prepare them, right? That these things might happen. And if seller doesn't ask for home, or buyer doesn't ask for home warranty, or buyer doesn't ask for repairs, great. That's just more money my seller gets to keep, right? As long as nobody says I'm not allowed to do it, I'm probably going to put in those net sheets a commission for the buyer's agent, preparing my seller that they're probably going to ask for it. Now, does the seller have to pay it? No. That'll all be negotiable. My expectation, though, is that, and again, everything's different. If a seller's not paying the buyer broker, the buyer's probably going to offer a lower price on the house, because otherwise buyer's paying both of those things, or the buyer's going to come unrepresented. And if buyer comes unrepresented, that is not good for the buyer or the seller. So I'll just say that. So definitely we want to be having those conversations with our seller, setting the expectation that even though it's not in the agreement anymore, it's still something that we can expect. And as this comes into play and it starts getting done in real life, we'll see what this morphs into, right? At this point, it's all kind of hypothetical. Any comments on this or questions?
Oh, no, thank you.
Okay. Okay, cool. Do you guys feel comfortable having these conversations with your sellers and buyers? It's something that if we're not comfortable with it, we need to be pulling out our scripts, and we need to be getting comfortable with it. Because when we go on an appointment, we want to be, well, first of all, we want to know what we're saying and why we're saying it, but we want to be confident saying it as well, right? We need to know our value. We need to know that we're worth whatever it is that we're charging. Because if we go in there and we sound hesitant, then it's not going to fare well for us, right? They want our confidence. Okay. Did you have a question, Alex?
I do. So the non-relating to this, but I heard you say scripts. So I'm new here with Keller Williams, well, relatively newish. So isn't there a folder someplace with all the scripts someplace?
So in the PC toolkit, there is a folder that has dialogues, dialogue helpers, I think is what it's called, which has a bunch of scripts. Now, because all of this is new, I don't know that we have them updated with scripts that are addressing these things, but you can definitely find scripts out there. You know, if you just like Google it, you could find some additional scripts. Also, there is there's another form. Oh, I don't know what it is right offhand. It's an advisory where it talks about commission to the buyer. And that form has language. So if you go in there and you kind of pull that up, read it, see what that language is, like that will help you with your scripts, just knowing what the contract says. Right.
Sure.
Yeah. So it's going to be interesting. It's going to be interesting. Hope, you know, we'll see how it all works out, but we definitely want to, know our scripts, know our value. That'll help us tremendously. So we have a few more minutes left, and so I'm prepared to end the training now because we've talked about what I wanted to talk about. But since we're here, is there any other contract related question that you might have that I might be able to help you guys with right now? Okay. Well, with that, I want to thank you guys for your time today. We're going to be doing these contracts and conversations, I think, every Monday. And so we'll go over different ones every week. And again, it's not just how to fill out the forms, but what conversations to have around them. You guys have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you around.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank you.